The human is an active and inquisitive beast, forever reaching out for things out of reach. In the 20th century, we've made the whole world our domain, except for one place. Antarctica remains remote, different, least known of our continents. It's not in fact so very far from Australia. Once the two continents were one, and even now the Antarctic coast is closer to Hobart than Perth is. The Great Southern Ocean washes Antarctica's shores as it does Australia's. It was inevitable that we'd come to see exploring Antarctica as the great adventure of modern times. A century ago, far-sighted Australians sought to know more about the vast icy region to our south. In 1886, excited by results from the British Challenger oceanographic voyage, some Melbourne scientists and entrepreneurs founded the Australian Antarctic Exploration Committee. Carstens Borchgrevink, a Norwegian living in Melbourne in the early 1890s, was in the right place at the right time. The committee had found Australian governments to be all talk and no cash. But the Norwegian government came good with money for an Antarctic expedition out of Melbourne. Borchgrevink, called aboard at the last moment, jumped ashore at Cape Adare, southeast of Hobart, in January 1895, to become, he later claimed, the first man on the Antarctic continent. 3 years later, his British-funded expedition out of Hobart spent the first Antarctic winter ashore, living in these huts which survive today. Antarctica held a lifelong fascination for Sydney geology professor Edgeworth David, who was 50 in 1907 when he joined Ernest Shackleton's South Pole expedition. David led a three-person team that in 1908, in a 2,000-kilometre journey across the Antarctic ice cap, became the first to reach the South Magnetic Pole. With him, in that party, was another geologist, from Adelaide, Douglas Mawson. Consumed by his Antarctic experience, Mawson threw all his energies into organising his own Australasian Antarctic expedition, which was given a rousing send-off from Hobart in December 1911. While Scott and Amundsen were preparing to race to the pole, Mawson's men were heading for the Antarctic coast due south of Australia. From bases at windy Cape Denison, which Mawson was later to call the home of the blizzard, and Queen Mary Land, they explored over 1,200 kilometres of East Antarctic coastline. Mawson, surviving a horrific solo sledge journey after his two companions died, returned to Adelaide a hero in 1914. A young Australian named Frank Hurley, who filmed the memorable images of Cape Denison's katabatic winds, achieved his greatest fame as an Antarctic photographer in Shackleton's ill-fated 1914 expedition with his unforgettable record of the end of the expedition ship Endurance, crushed by the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. Hurley was also there from 1929 when Mawson, in his last Antarctic journeys, led combined British, Australian and New Zealand expeditions to explore the East Antarctic coast and claim the hinterland for Britain.
In the name of His Majesty George V, King of Great Britain, now therefore I, Sir Douglas Mawson, do hereby proclaim and declare to all men that from and after the date of these present, the full sovereignty of the territory which we have discovered and explored, south of latitude 64 degrees, and as far as the South Pole, vests in His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors forever.
When soon afterwards Britain transferred responsibility for the claims to Australia, the Australian territorial claim in Antarctica, maintained to this day, amounted to 42% of the whole continent, by far the largest of the 7 national claims to Antarctic territory. The Second World War came and went. Douglas Mawson continued to lobby the Australian government, true to his Antarctic dreams. In April 1947, the government approved funding for a national Antarctic expedition. By May, the expedition's chief executive officer, Stuart Campbell, was appointed, and in July the expedition's name received official sanction. The Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, now known in the Antarctic world by its acronym ANARI. By December, a semi-retired naval landing ship called LST-3501 transported the first wintering ANARI party of 14 men across stormy seas southwest from Fremantle to wild, desolate, magnificent Herd Island. At Atlas Cove, under towering Big Ben, Australia's only active volcano, the men set up the first ANARI base. In the same summer, a research base was built at Buckles Bay on another sub-Antarctic island, Macquarie, which, like Herd Island, had seen severe depredation by the seal oil industry in earlier times. A renewed effort to study the animals, climate and upper atmosphere of the sub-Antarctic was now underway. What remained was a foothold in Antarctica itself. That became the main aim of Philip Law, who from 1949 was director of the newly established Australian Antarctic Division. Like Mawson, Law proved an adept lobbyist and succeeded in the early 1950s in getting the funds to charter a Danish ice-strengthened ship, Kista Dan. On its way to Antarctica, Kista took on Huskies at Herd Island to form the basis of Australia's Antarctic dog teams. The ship finally broke through the ice into Horseshoe Harbour on the Antarctic coast southwest of Perth late in 1954. The shore party, led by Law, founded the first permanent base of any nation south of the Antarctic Circle, naming it in honour of the great pioneer, Sir Douglas Mawson. Antarctica was attracting unprecedented attention from the world's nations when a new Australian station named Davis was established 600 kilometres east of Mawson in the ice-free Vestfold Hills in 1957. The 1957-58 International Geophysical Year saw many countries set up scientific bases around the continent. It led directly to the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1961, binding its 12 original members, including Australia, to peaceful cooperation and untrammeled research in Antarctica, regardless of territorial claims or external differences. By the time it signed the Antarctic Treaty, Australia had a third continental station, Wilkes, taken over from the United States in 1959. 10 years later, with the year-round inundation of Wilkes by snow, Australia built a new station nearby called Casey, which itself was replaced by a new Casey station opened in 1988 during a major rebuilding program for all stations. In Australia, Antarctic operations and research became centred on the nation's most southerly capital, Hobart. The Antarctic Division's 1981 move into a new purpose-built headquarters south of the city provided a home for research into Antarctic animals, plants and microorganisms, both past and present, and the study of the Earth's upper atmosphere, along with all the necessary support functions. Hobart also became the international headquarters of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. In the early 1990s, an Antarctic Cooperative Research Centre was established at the University of Tasmania. Hobart became Australia's major Antarctic port, the summer home for the ships employed by Australia to strengthen its Antarctic presence. In 1990, Australia finally had an icebreaker it could proudly call its own, Aurora Australis, built at Newcastle. In the 1994 summer, Aurora transported long-range helicopters to Antarctica, heralding a major shift in ANARI operations. The larger helicopters have a great potential to increase the mobility of ANARI, providing the first scheduled air transport between Australia stations and rapid transport to distant field locations. This emergency 1,200-kilometre return flight to Casey Station and back to Aurora late in 1994 carried a biologist injured in the field. The high standard of medical care in Antarctica underlines the high value that ANARE places on its people. Each of Australia's 4 modern stations supports a year-round population of about 20 expeditioners, rising to 2 or 3 times that number in summer. They comprise scientists, including doctors studying the human condition in Antarctica, and their support people. In 1997, ANARE folk celebrate 50 years of continuous Antarctic service. How can we explain this half-century of national effort? What is it that draws us year after year to send scientists and the people who support them to this icy wilderness? Let's look at some facts. Thinking about the Antarctic means thinking on a massive scale. The Southern Ocean, nexus of the world's great oceans, surrounds Antarctica with cold but nutrient-rich waters that support an abundance of life. An enormous expanse of ice, larger in area than Antarctica itself, covers the ocean through winter. The Southern Ocean's complex and vast circulatory processes make it a subject of global concern. The Antarctic continent is nearly twice as big as Australia. The highest point on Australian territory is not Kosciuszko, but a 4,000-metre high featureless mass of Antarctic ice, Dome Argus, that no Australian has yet visited. The world's largest ice stream, the 40-kilometre wide Lambert Glacier, is in Australian territory. Antarctica's ice sheet, most of it several kilometres thick, holds around 90% of the world's ice and 70% of its fresh water. Some of its icebergs are half the size of Tasmania. In 1991, Antarctic Treaty member countries, now numbering over 40, signed the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, commonly called the Madrid Protocol. This historic agreement bans mining activity in the Antarctic and pledges member nations to work together to ensure that its environment remains in a state as close to pristine as possible. The agreement designates Antarctica as a nature reserve devoted to peace and science. While the Madrid Protocol was being finalised, Australia was looking afresh at its Antarctic research program. It defined 4 key goals: understanding global change, maintaining the treaty system and Australia's role in it, protecting the Antarctic environment, and obtaining information of practical value such as meteorology. In November 1994, long-term strategies in 6 research fields were published. The first looks at the Antarctic atmosphere and its weather, climate and atmospheric processes and their influence on Australian and global environments. The second involved studies of the multitude of life forms and ecosystems of coastal Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, including penguins, seals, and the ubiquitous crustacean called krill, and ways of managing these resources so that they remain viable. The third research field examines the geological processes of the continent and the Southern Ocean floor, including Australia's ancient links with Antarctica before the breakup of Gondwana about 80 million years ago. The fourth field is glaciology, seeking to establish the linkages between Antarctic continental and sea ice, global and regional climate, and sea level. This work has included ice flow studies deep in the Antarctic interior, an examination of ice cores taken from the 1,200-metre thick ice sheet at Law Dome near Casey. The new field of human impacts research investigates the effect of human activity on the Antarctic environment, including that of a new and growing Antarctic industry, commercial tourism. In the 6th Antarctic research field, scientists are making extensive use of Aurora australis to investigate the circulation of the Southern Ocean and how water movements and mixing affect biological productivity. Studies of the ocean between Tasmania and Antarctica using sophisticated sampling and data gathering equipment are already well advanced. We are now in a new Antarctic age. Superpower rivalries have gone. New research agendas are being applied under a new environment regime. Global concerns are now the driving force behind Antarctic research. Australia's become a leading nation in investigating Antarctica's atmosphere, ice cap, oceans, and wildlife. As we gain greater knowledge of the way our planet works, we've come to know more keenly than ever the importance of understanding the vast region to our south and its crucial importance in Australian and global processes. Antarctica remains, as it always has been, the greatest wilderness on Earth. We have discovered much about it in recent decades. We have infinitely more to find out. The great adventure continues.